So we'll begin the lecture. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the first Insight Series talk of this semester. We are very lucky to have Professor Terry Cannon here with us, who is joining us from the UK. And the title of his talk today is Poverty, Vulnerability, and Climate Change. Who is responsible? Competing narratives of suffering and the excuses of the powerful. I'll just give a brief abstract of the talk, after which I'll bring my students to introduce Professor Terry. So, as we all know, we are living in the age of massive global warming and climate change. We have been undergoing a massive change in the Anthropocene, or as some researchers like to call it, the Capitalocene. The abstract for this talk is as follows. The climate crisis is at the intersection of two sets of injustices. The first is the obvious one, concerning the businesses and governance and governments historically in the West that have caused the majority of carbon emissions that affect the majority of carbon emissions that affect the people around the world, who have played little to no part in causing it, yet experience the worst of its impacts. The second is less obvious. Most of those same people are badly affected by climate change and are already poor and vulnerable. They live within the unjust systems of power that reduce their access to resources and production assets, income, and welfare. The conventional way that academics deal with this idea is that climate change is an intensifier or magnifier of existing poverty, vulnerability, and inequality. But this analysis avoids the need to analyze their the root causes of their poverty and vulnerability, which are related to power that allocates resources and income unfairly. If climate change is thought to be simply as a magnifier of existing poverty, the causes tend to be disguised and effectively forgotten. Governments of the global South willingly emphasize the first injustice to avoid taking responsibility for the second one. Donors, including the World Bank, Asian Development Bank from the global North, join this game. They do not want to comment on the causes of poverty and vulnerability in India and other countries that suffer because of their alliances with the government. And yet, it should be clear that dealing with climate change injustice without reducing or even eradicating the existing causes of poverty and vulnerability is completely meaningless. This is the abstract of today's talk, and now I'll welcome my student Shweta to introduce the Insight series and to introduce our esteemed speaker, Professor Terry Cannon. Shweta.
Thank you so much, sir. Hello and good morning, good evening, everyone. Welcome to a special Insight Series lecture hosted by the Humanities and Social Sciences discipline at IIT Gandhinagar. The Insight Series lecture began in 2022 by Professor Ashish Khakha with a focus on development and indigenous peoples issues. Previous luminaries who have graced the lecture include P. Sainath, Professor Rashid Kharidi, Professor Mahmood Mamdani, and Professor Edgar Nansuno. Today, we are very fortunate to have with us Professor Terry Cannon. Professor Terry Cannon is a recently retired Emeritus Senior Research Fellow at the Institute of Development Studies in the UK. He taught the MSc Climate Change Development and Policy. For many years, he has taught and researched on development studies, disaster studies, and adaptation to climate change, working at the University of Greenwich, the Natural Resources Institute, King's College London, the University of Copenhagen University, of Reading University of Brussels, and Catalog University, Leuven, Belgium. His main research focus is on rural livelihoods, disaster vulnerability, and climate change adaptation, especially at the local level. He has been an advisor to the IFRC Red Cross and UNDP on local disaster risk reduction globally and in Vietnam and China, and worked with the International Center for Climate Change and Development in Bangladesh for many years. He is one of the co-authors of At Risk, Natural Hazards, People's Vulnerability and Disasters, 1994 and 2004 second edition, which has become one of the most widely cited and used books in the field. Today, he will be talking to us about a very important topic of poverty, vulnerability, and climate change, competing narratives of suffering and the excuses of the powerful. Please join me in welcoming Professor Cannon to IIT Gandhinagar. Professor Cannon, the floor is all yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very nice to be here with you. I visited Ahmedabad many, many years ago, and during my visits to India, in those times, I fell in love with the country. So although I'm not with you, I hope to be there one day, and it's very nice to be talking to you all. So this is a talk really which is focusing on how we understand what causes a problem and how different interest groups can divert attention away from the real causes of problems because it suits them in their situation of power. It is more convenient to them to be able to ignore what is really causing a problem to start blaming different things. So I'm going to do this and hope to leave enough time for quite a lot of discussion afterwards. So I'm trying to change my slide now. Hang on. Okay, so just as background introduction, in the international system, that means in the COP negotiations and the international discussions about what to do about climate change, we can analyze two main approaches. The first is that which is about reducing the emissions of greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide especially, plus others. And this was right from the start of the climate negotiations going right back to 1988. But it was then realized that humans had to prepare for climate change because even if emissions were reduced very rapidly, the Earth's climate would still be changed, temperatures would be going up. And so it was eventually recognized that there would need to be adaptation. This really becomes more significant after 2005. So these are the two main responses in the international negotiating systems about what to do about climate change. Now, my focus is going to be much more on the second of these, the adaptation area, but there are two other important modifications to this because the arguments came much later that actually it was wrong to blame greenhouse gases coming from fossil fuels entirely because there was also the problem of emissions from deforestation and land degradation. And so this introduced another agenda called RED plus reduced emissions, blah, 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 which was first discussed in 2005 and then became quite significant. And that's because it was estimated, it's extremely difficult to get it accurately, but it's estimated that 20% of emissions that that cause climate change are actually from deforestation. So a very significant amount. And then the next aspect, which also was about the impossibility of complete adaptation. So a loss and damage argument emerged, which said that actually we can't, in many countries, can't adapt quickly enough or adequately enough. There will still be damage from climate change. And so we need to worry about the loss and damage that will be caused. And this became part of the agenda in 2010. But you might, I hope, be aware that nothing has happened in terms of funding for this. There is a huge argument about why the countries of the so-called global north do not want to take any responsibility for this. So this is part of the background, and you'll see why it's relevant to the discussion that I want to introduce. Thank you. Now, in terms of the cumulative emissions, that is from 1751 to, sorry, I'm just needing to clear my screen. From 1751 up to relatively recently, these are the emissions, the total amount of emissions of carbon dioxide that have entered the atmosphere from different regions of the world or different countries of the world. And you can see that the West, or the global North as it is sometimes called, is the most significant source historically of these emissions. Over on the left-hand side of the chart, the USA and Europe, and Japan over on the far right under Asia. But we also can see that other countries have become very, very significant emitters. China is now the largest emitter in the world, and India is quite significant. And this will enter into our discussion later on. Ashish, you need to mute your microphone. I'm getting feedback from the hall. Oh, it is muted, so we should be all right. Okay. Now, if we look at actually the graph of emissions, the graph of emissions over time, it looks like this. So you can see that the emissions of carbon dioxide don't really start until around 1880, which is why it is often used as the starting point for the negotiations. And you can see that it rapidly increases after 1960. And you can see that the majority of emissions for quite a while are still coming from the so-called global North, but now a majority of the emissions are coming from China, other countries in Asia, and so on. You can see that Africa has hardly any emissions at all, and very little from South America as well. Now, this relates to an argument about whether or not it is justice that so-called countries of the so-called global South have the right to pollute, have the right to continue to emit carbon dioxide, because it will support the development of their people and therefore the reduction of poverty. And that is something we will come back to shortly. What I want to propose is that we can have these two narratives on climate change, which Ashish outlined at the start, which to some extent are contradictory, and we need to understand how they interact. And the first narrative is the one that focuses on relations between countries, that says that climate change is mainly caused by rich countries. Now, I put rich countries in quote marks and some of the others, poor countries, in quote marks, because I find these very inadequate ways of describing the division of countries in the world. And we can perhaps debate that later on. You'll see why I think it's not at all adequate as we go on. So in this narrative, the negative effects of climate change are global. They affect absolutely everyone on this earth. But the argument is that they have their worst impact on poor countries that have most poor people and more and vulnerable people who will be vulnerable to climate change. And that is, of course, true, largely true. And so the justice argument requires allowing poor countries to burn more fossil fuels, to release more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, to enable their people to enjoy development, to have better development. This is also the argument that if they enjoy development, if they have a chance to burn fossil fuels, then that development that happens will reduce poverty. I think that's questionable, as we'll see in a minute. And this also means that justice requires that the rich countries provide finance to the poor countries to help them to adapt to climate change and to pay for loss and damage, the two agendas that were in the first slide. So this narrative is very comforting for certain actors in the world because it puts the blame on the global North or the rich countries, whatever terminology you want to use. And it evades the question of why are people poor in the global South, because those people have been poor for decades. They haven't suddenly become poor because of climate change. In other words, climate change is not the cause of why people are poor in Bangladesh or Tanzania or India or anywhere else. That their poverty is not caused by climate change. So if we use the normal statement that climate change is going to magnify or multiply the existing poverty of people and vulnerability of people, especially in the global south, what does that actually mean? Because the fact that we now just have climate change is not suddenly going to reduce the causes of why they are poor. And this is why we have to focus on what causes poverty and who is responsible for it. So I would like to focus on the second narrative, which is actually that this is about class. It's about elites and exploitation in all countries of the world. That climate change is not the cause of why people are already poor and vulnerable. Those causes have been going on for decades. And existing poverty makes people vulnerable to climate change as well. In other words, the people of India are vulnerable to climate change, not because of climate change, but because of the systems of power within which people live in the country. Class, caste, gender, and other processes that make people poor. And of course, climate change will increase the numbers of poor people in the world by hundreds of millions. And that is because of the systems of power that they live in. And that is what we need to understand and emphasize. So the existing reasons for poverty will not go away just because we now have climate change. And so focusing on climate change as if it's a cause of poverty is very misleading. And this is the crux of my point, the core of my point. The narrative that blames climate change enables governments, elites, the World Bank, businesses to escape their responsibilities for how they are causing people's poverty and vulnerability. So that is really the core of the argument that I want to make with you. For poor countries, of course, most poor countries were colonized. Wealth was extracted from them, sometimes over centuries. In the case of India, it was over a number of centuries. And what I would suggest is actually colonial systems of exploitation. For example, in South Asia, land tenure systems of India and other Bangladesh and so on were actually taken over by new post-independence elites for their own benefit. The semi-feudal, or whatever we want to call it, land systems of South Asia have become a source of wealth and income for the elite, which took control after independence. So we need to ask the question, what proportion of the poverty of people today in the countries that were colonized can be blamed on or explained by past colonization? And of course, we need to understand the processes by which that happened, but I would argue that relatively little of the direct poverty experienced by people in the global south today is actually can be attributed to past colonization. How much of the current poverty is due to international exploitation, for example, by Western businesses of people in India, Bangladesh, and so on? Well, some of it obviously is, because countries are exposed to significant exploitation by Western corporations still today. We might call it neocolonialism or imperialism, whatever we want to call it. Yes, but we need to understand what proportion of that extraction of wealth from people in the so-called global south is due to international exploitation and how much is domestic. My argument primarily is that governments in so-called poor countries find it very convenient to blame climate change, and therefore the rich countries who have been historically responsible for most of the global emissions. So this is the story that I want to evaluate and examine. These categories that are used about wealth, I don't think are very useful, because I think they obscure why people are poor in all countries. We used to use the term third world, which implied that there was a first and a second world, and that's gone out of fashion, unfortunately, in my view, because it became politically incorrect to use third world, because it was some people understood that it implied that those countries were third class, inferior or something. That actually was not the origins of the term, but we probably won't have time to go into that now. We had the division of developed and developing countries, rich, poor countries, and now quite popular is the global north versus the global south. And we also have people using, to be more politically correct, the majority world and the minority world, meaning the majority world being the global south and the minority world being the so-called rich north. I don't find these very helpful at all, because why don't we just talk about class as the major system that determines the distribution of income and access to assets, that means wealth, in the world. And these systems operate all over the world, and they're not particularly useful. It is a much more useful way of understanding the differences between rich and poor in the world than these global categories, which I'll explain a bit more as we go on. Now, to explain what I mean, starting off with, this is Britain at the peak. Somebody's got their microphone on. This is Britain, or some of the people, a very large proportion of the people living in Britain, in 1900. I've chosen these photos because this is at the peak of the British Empire. Who got the wealth that arose from the colonization? And this is why I don't think using rich world, poor world is particularly useful, because although Britain was a so-called rich country, it wasn't the wealth extracted from India and other colonies and from the working class in Britain itself was not shared. These are pictures of around 1900, malnourished children. At the bottom, that's the toilets, some of the toilets that people used in slums. Some of the people had to be brought into photography studios to be photographed properly. And you can see they're malnourished, they're wearing rags. And these are on the streets of Liverpool around 1900. And so there are hundreds of thousands of people living like this. And the poor, actually for more than a century, sorry, this one is particularly interesting because it shows the malnutrition, which is very similar to pictures of Indians in the 19th century, which you will all have seen of famines in India. Well, here we have a significant proportion of people in England severely malnourished. Child and infant mortality rates were very, very high in Britain in the working class in this period. And poor people for more than a century were put into workhouses as a form of relief from poverty. And they lived in their hundreds in workhouses like this is London in 1911. This is one of the large workhouses. They were operating until the 1930s, which housed more than 1,000 people in a town called Bath. This is one in London in 1900. And so you get a sense, well, all that wealth was not going to the people of Britain. And so that is why I think a class analysis is much more useful than pretending that Britain was rich and India was poor, because there were rich people in India and poor people in India, and there were rich people, very rich people in Britain, and very many very poor people in Britain. And so this is the focus that I think is much more useful to understand what's going on with climate change. So if we look at the data, this is data from the World Inequality Report published 2022. And you can see that this is Britain, this is wealth. So this is assets, property owned and so on. And you can see very clearly from this until around 1940, the poorest 50% of the population had no wealth at all. They had no house, they had no capital, they had no savings. And you can see the top 10% of the world in 1900, the top 10% of the population in Britain had more than 90% of the wealth. Now that has come down, and we'll explain why it's come down in recent decades in a minute, down to around 50%, but it's still well above 50% in recent years. and the bottom 50% of the population have very, very little wealth. It is, as in, I mean, people often say about India or the global south that everyone is just one medical bill away from abject poverty. In Britain, the poverty would be, well, I think the figures speak for themselves. So this is income. The previous one was wealth. This is income. So the bottom 50% of the British population has only 20% of the income, whereas the top 10% of the people have now nearly 40% of the income. Now you can see that it has risen significantly in recent decades because of neoliberal policies and reduced taxation on the wealthier population. So very unequal access to wealth, ownership of wealth, and very unequal income. Now let's turn to India for the same period. We can see that in India, the bottom 50% of the population, actually their wealth has gone down in recent years. And of course, the wealth of the top 10% has gone up by comparison. And that has gone up. And we could argue that it has gone up with the liberalization of the Indian economy, which began around 1999. And this is quite a significant inequality in the world. This actually data goes back to 1900, so this is more comparable with the British data. And you can see here that in India, the bottom 50% got a slight increase in their share of never more than 20%, and it's gone down since, and probably since COVID, it's gone down even more. Whereas the wealthy 10%, their income has just gone up and up, especially since the liberalization of the around 1991, the adoption of neoliberal policies. So grave inequality in both countries. But the point I wanted to make was that in Britain, the so-called wealth generated by colonization was not going to the population. They had no wealth and very low incomes compared with the wealthy. We also know that in many parts of the world, the problems of poverty are under the control of governments. So this is relatively recently in Nigeria, a country which has been a major exporter of oil since around the 1950s, which has generated a huge income for the country, which has not really benefited the poor. You might know that many people have to steal petrol in Nigeria to even run a vehicle. And you can see this Amnesty's estimate of 2 million people being evicted. We have the irony now that in some parts of the country, including the big cities on the coast, the government is removing these slums, so-called slums, because they get flooded. And they've said, we've got to do this to make people safe from climate change. So there's quite an interesting thing there. And here, Nigeria's housing needs, where you have 95 million people, that's half the population, living in extreme poverty in a country which has had hundreds of billions of dollars of oil wealth coming into it over the last 50, 60 years. So I want to emphasize that the world is the way it is because those who have power want it to be this way. They like it. They want this. And they control the economies in order to benefit themselves. Which means that any attempt to change how it's done by academic research to advise policy, by NGOs or UN organizations trying to change it, it will be working against the interests of those who already benefit from what is going on. So everything that is done to try to change the poverty and vulnerability of people in the world is going against those who will lose benefits from it, or it challenges their ideology or belief system. Their ego gets hurt if they're challenged on their ideology of let the rich get rich first, which was the Chinese slogan, and you will have equivalent ones in India. And the other reason that they don't want to change is because they're stupid and they don't realize that following the policies that they do follow may end up actually depriving them of their own sources of wealth as the world collapses with global warming. And this phrase has been used by a number of people. It's very difficult to find its origins, but I think it's very telling. It has become easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. Quite an extraordinary thing to get your head round, and I think it's perfectly valid that we can think about the catastrophe of global warming at the end of the world, and that is easier to imagine than trying to change the system of class, the class-based systems which are leading to that collapse of the world. Why did it get better in Britain? It hasn't got perfect by any means. This is the block of flats, apartments, which I grew up in, which was built around 1946, where I was born and brought up. This was council housing, which was part of the redistribution of income from the rich to the poor through a taxation system. And the taxation system enabled the National Health Service to begin. When this began in 1948, the top rate of income tax was 90%. That means if your income was very high, you paid 90% of the extra high income in tax. And this was normal, as you will see in a number of countries on the graph, which I'll show you in a minute. And here was this most extraordinary thing where from 1948 onwards, if you needed healthcare, dental service, glasses, medicines, and so on, you got it free. And this was the way in which taxation redistributed wealth and caused justice, provided justice. Before that, people had to pay for medical care in Britain, as you do for many in the United States today. So if you didn't have money, you got very sick, and sometimes you would die because you didn't have money. And this is very common in many parts of the world. These are the tax rates on the top rate of tax in some key countries. And you'll see that in these top marginal income tax rates were up to 90%. In these countries between 1940 and around 1985, in these countries, the richest people on their high incomes were paying between 60 and 90% of their extra high income in taxation. And this is what paid for the redistribution of wealth towards paying for free schools, free healthcare, and housing like the house which I lived in, the flat which I lived in when I was born. You can see that after neoliberalism comes in, Mrs. Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, and here, those tax rates are reduced significantly, so that in all of those Western countries, the tax rate on the richest is never more than 60%, and in fact, in the United States goes down to 23%, and is now around, it's 46% in the United Kingdom at the moment. So those tax rates, that if you earn more than £150,000 a year, on any income over that, you pay 46% in tax. And that is why the graph I showed you earlier of income has redistributed income from the richer to the poorer, although the rich still have a very high share of the total. Now, some years ago, Amartya Sen wrote this article, which appeared in a number of magazines, saying, why is there not universal healthcare in other countries, including India? And he said the issue is about tax. Why are these countries not collecting tax from the rich in order to pay for basic services? And he gives examples of some countries where this has happened, which are very good examples of how this might change the lives of people. And one of the interesting things about free healthcare systems is that once the system becomes free, as with schooling, you don't need such high income because you don't have to worry about paying for being sick and so on. so you don't have to have such a high income in case you get sick. And some of you will have seen a few years ago Rutger Bregman's denunciation of wealth at the Davos World Economic Forum. We won't have time to see this, but I do urge you to watch this video, and the slides will be made available for you at the end, where one billionaire in the audience says, well, where on earth was tax as high as you think it should be? And he said, well, the United States, the top rate of income tax in the United States until Ronald Reagan came along was 90%. In Britain, it was around the same. So these were the ways in which justice would be done to reduce poverty. Britain still has poverty. A very significant number of people, around 1 million households, have to go to food banks to get their food. And when our students come here from India and Bangladesh, they are shocked by the people living on the streets. There are thousands and thousands of people living on the streets. They have no housing, they have mental health problems, and so on. And there are around 1/3 of 1 million households in Britain that do not have proper housing. They're in temporary and very poor accommodation, and thousands who live on the streets. And you walk around cities in Britain, this is what you will see. And it's quite shocking for our students who come from India. They think, well, this is like a third world country. So what we need to do is to understand how climate change is perceived and who perceives it and why is it useful to perceive it in the way that they do. And one key thing is that countries will say, Bangladesh is especially good at this, we're the worst affected country in the world. We have all these problems of floods, cyclones, sea level rise, and so on. But there's very poor understanding of climate change in many cases, and a lack of desire to explain why people are poor and vulnerable, because it's political. It's extremely difficult in a country like Bangladesh, and probably in India, you can advise me on that, to say, well, actually, the reason people are poor is because of things that are going on in this country. It's nothing to do with climate change. So the question I want to ask is, who benefits from the narrative that climate change is causing poverty or is likely to make more people poor, without actually examining the causes of poverty today? So, as you all know, Pakistan was flooded very badly last year. And these are some of the images that we all saw in the press. And it was a very common statement all over the world for people to say, oh, and people in the Pakistan government said this as well, Pakistan, 1/3 of the country is underwater, which was wrong. It was actually much less than 1/3 of the country. Where this figure came from is because the Minister of Climate Change, there is one now in Pakistan, misunderstood. Actually, 1/3 of the districts in Pakistan had some impact of climate change, but not 1/3 of the total territory. This is the territory which was flooded. You can see it's well below 1/3 of the country. That was the floods in 2010, not that different. It is understood that the flooding last year was partly a product of global warming, but floods are normal in Bangladesh and Pakistan and India. They're not all caused by climate change. Climate change will make the floods worse. So if you blame this flood on climate change, then that is wrong, because a lot of the problems of the poor people are not arising because of climate change. Now, this blaming of climate change is very, very widespread, and it's increasingly amongst academics who don't look at things properly. So last year, I was asked to review a paper on Ghana in which the paper title blamed flooding on climate change. And I said, oh, well, what's the evidence that northern Ghana is being affected by climate change? So eventually they sent me the rainfall figures for the part of the country they were looking at. And you can see the rainfall figures going back to 1953. There's no increase in the rainfall, annual rainfall. There could be a change in the distribution within each year. We don't have the data for that, but you can see actually the rainfall in the 1960s, 50s, and 60s was higher. So climate change gets blamed for things, which means that the narrative of the global north being at fault is actually reinforced because it throws the blame onto the causes of climate change coming from the northern countries burning their fossil fuels. Somebody who wrote this book on Bangladesh 3 years ago was advised by somebody to say, well, you've got to put climate change in your title. You haven't mentioned climate change, but that's what you've got to mention. That's how you get money, and that's how you get interest in what you're doing. So climate change has become something that you include to get funding in your research projects. Your NGOs and UN agencies all want to blame climate change, even when, and you'll see this quite surprising, in Bangladesh, it's very difficult to blame climate change. So how is climate change perceived for Bangladesh? One of the worst. So what is wrong with this? How do we understand the problems of poverty and vulnerability? How should they be understood? And what needs to happen for people to adapt successfully to climate change? Well, 2 years ago, actually nearly 3 years ago, this article appeared in the New York Times. And myself and a Bangladeshi friend who'd been doing a bit of work on Bangladesh challenged it. On the right, you see the map of the flooding in Bangladesh. And the article blamed this on river flooding caused by global warming. But actually, we looked at it, and actually, most of the rainfall here is, flooding here is from rainfall in these. I'm not going to go into detail, but the only one that is likely attributable to rivers flooding is B at the top. I hope you can see my cursor moving. This one here, where the Brahmaputra did overflow to some extent. But all these are rainfall floods in which the rain of the monsoon has been very significant. And this flooding is not abnormal for Bangladesh. So we look at the actual data. Here is the map showing the proportion of land, the percentage of land area flooded. And we can see that in recent years, it is not especially high. Some of the worst go back here. And in the 1950s, many of the years had a higher proportion of the land flooded in Bangladesh than in recent years. Now, I'm not saying that climate change isn't happening. It is, and it will make it worse. But you see, the narrative to blame climate change for poverty in Bangladesh is very powerful, but it's false, because the flooding is not worse. And but everyone wants to blame climate change for what is going on. And these slums in Dhaka, which many of you will have seen photos of, they're not very different from those in India, have been there for decades. Nothing to do with climate change. Poverty is not caused by climate change. And here are the cyclones. This is a way of representing the cyclone history. So you'll see that the number of dead, which is the blue bars, has diminished significantly thanks to early warning systems and evacuations. You'll see that the wind speed, there's no significant increase in the wind speed associated with cyclones. And also, you'll see that the number of cyclones well, no, this is the death. It's the next slide, which looks at the number of cyclones. You'll see in this one that there's no significant increase in the number of cyclones. So this is the number of tropical cyclones, that includes severe ones, but these are smaller ones as well, has really hardly increased at all. And in fact, you have some fairly serious ones back here in the 1970s and so on. So it's quite difficult to blame climate change when actually the number of cyclones has not increased. Now, I see that time is running on. I'm going to skip over these and focus on some of the problems around cyclones. Well, the number of deaths has gone down significantly because Bangladesh, as with Orissa, been very successful in using warnings and evacuations to reduce mortality. But what this means is that hundreds of lakhs of people are now surviving, and they live in very, very poor conditions for months, weeks, or even in the rest of their entire lives. Because although you can save lives, the political and economic system does not change people's lives. You can save lives, but not change people's how they manage to live. So if you survive the Bangladesh cyclones, you will live in very, very poor conditions for months, years, or even decades, or including the rest of your life. And you have this kind of statement from and very little goes on to enable people to have a better life after the cyclone. And that is because the existing systems of power in the country are designed to perpetuate poverty and inequality. They are the system under which those who have power want it to be. Now, I'm also not going to have time for this, but basically this very complicated chart shows you the proportion of people who are landless in and have hardly any land in Bangladesh, which again is the inequality of asset ownership in the country. So the conclusion is, let's stop excusing those who cause poverty and other problems, because we know who they are and what they are, but they willingly use climate change as an excuse not to fix what they actually control themselves. So the powerful, the elite, they control the systems of power. They want to have these systems of power. They don't want them to be changed. And it's very convenient for them to blame climate change in narrative number one, in other words, the international narrative, because they don't want the focus put on them as the reason why people are poor and vulnerable in their countries. So I'm going to stop there and look forward to your questions and comments. Thank you very much.
Hello. Yeah. Thank you so much, Jerry, for that wonderful deliberation. I think it has raised a lot of provocations, and especially those. And I teach this course on development studies, and I often mention there that this whole classic debate between those in the core countries and those in the peripheral countries it's a long-standing debate within development studies itself, that the core countries, the countries, quote unquote, in the global north have much to answer about for the historical exploitation, but countries in the peripheral region, say India, Bangladesh, other countries, unless and until their policies do not break free from the dependency model, we cannot really think of an alternative to either address climate change or poverty. So I think your lecture, in a way, really fits well in the themes that I teach in class. So at this point, I would request if I just had, these were some of my observations, and one question which I had from my side would be that if at all we have to break free from the dependency of the global north, what are the strategies that you can recommend, or if any strategies that you can think of in a way that that the global south, or for that matter the peripheral, quote unquote, peripheral countries can step away from?
Okay. Do you want to take a number of questions and then I'll try and put something together?
I'll just see, maybe you can begin with this question and then we can go on to some further questions. I'll give the audience time to think of some questions.
Okay. Well, I'd be uncomfortable with your framing of it, Ashish, and we need a much longer debate and discussion on this. I think the idea that the countries of the global south, which, as I've already explained, is not a category I find useful, we need to understand what we mean by them being dependent. I mean, this argument emerged especially from Latin America in the 1960s and 70s, where you found that Latin American countries were actually not, quotes, developing as rapidly as you might expect. But those countries were actually settler colonies. Brazil, Argentina, Bolivia, they were all settler colonies with Europeans who had conquered those territories. And then in terms of international competition for capitalism had not been as successful as, for example, Japan or South Korea or other parts of the world. And so they needed, and their arguments were framed around the dependency school in order to show that this was, if you like, post-colonial economies which were being harmed by the role of the West in structuring the global economy. And the argument was predominantly about the exchange, unequal exchange. And one book was actually called Unequal Exchange. And so they said we are at a disadvantage in terms of the powerful countries like Europe and the United States, determining the way in which we can or cannot compete and become and have higher economic growth in the global economy. But I look at it in another way. I see these as settler colonies. These are in fact, they are like South Africa was. They engaged in apartheid against their indigenous people and in some countries against their black population. And they were claiming special privilege for their capitalists in order to argue against what they regarded as the exploitation of their economies by other parts of the global capitalist system. So I would reappraise the dependency argument. I would argue that India is far from having any dependency on the so-called rich countries at the moment. China, not at all, apart from needing customers for its outputs. I mean, an Indian billionaire actually owns the largest part of the British steel industry, and so we have reverse imperialism in that sense. And I think that's why we need to understand class rather than relations between countries, because all of the analysis that looks at the relationships between countries, in my view, is designed to disguise and avoid looking at who is controlling the economies.
Okay, thank you. So there's one question online from Mihir Bhatt. He asks, Dr. Cannon, what are a few next steps we can take to address this as the colonies themselves are becoming colonizers, both internally as well as internationally?
Well, I would argue that in terms of analysis, we have to go into class analysis, and internal colonization in India might, for example, be around the invasion of tribal peoples' areas for extracting timber or minerals. We had an interesting situation at IDS about 10 years ago, where the chief minister of Orissa, was visiting Britain, and he was having meetings with the aid ministry, DFID, and he said, "Oh, I want to visit IDS because it's so famous in terms of development studies and so on." Well, some of the Indian students organized a protest against him coming, because at that time he was the prime minister. He didn't speak Oriya. He was part of the process by which tribal areas were being attacked for mining and so on. And so he didn't come because he was afraid that the protesters would actually disturb his calm. So you have always had internal colonization of this type in many countries. With China, you see Tibet and the Uyghurs in Xinjiang and so on. But internationally, I think what we need is it has become extremely difficult in Western social science. I mean, in Europe, in North America, and I believe also in India, and certainly in Bangladesh, which I know a bit, extremely difficult to actually even mention class analysis, because it's regarded as leftist or socialist or even Marxist. But it isn't. It's actually the real world. The real world is run by classes and by elite classes. And they are the ones who exploit and oppress other people for their own benefit. And until we actually take seriously the understanding causation of why people are poor and vulnerable, then wherever it is, our analysis, our understanding, and how we support those who are exploited and oppressed cannot get better.
Okay, are there any questions from the audience? Yeah, so please identify yourself and you can ask the question.
Hi, Professor Cannon. Really nice talk. I'm Prasad I'm doing PhD in physics. So I had a doubt in the plot that you showed for share of income as well as share of wealth for top 10% and bottom 50%. Isn't it misrepresenting the actual data on? Wouldn't it be better to see absolute figures in terms of the inflation rate or purchasing power parity?
Did you get the question, Eric?
Well, I don't think it's a good question, because we should always make sure that we're looking at purchasing power parity. But you don't need to. If it's the distribution of income between classes, then the issue of parity is applicable to all classes. You could argue that actually using purchasing power parity it doesn't help, because we know that, for example, poor people have to spend a very, very high percentage of their income on food and rent, or on accommodation. Whereas richer people, they spend a very much smaller proportion of their total. So if you were to look at purchasing power parity, that is useful between countries, but it's not useful between classes.
Thank you.
Any other questions from the audience? Camellia and Charu. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Professor, for the presentation. It was really interesting, but I just wanted to know, when you talked about Bangladesh, I wanted to know about the whole idea about island sinking, which is linked to climate change and erosion, soil erosion per se. A lot of smaller islands in Bangladesh, Sundarban or Indian Sundarbans, are also being affected by sea level rise and erosion. So I just wanted to know, what is your take on the aspect of climate change here and its impact on that? Can we think it about like a catalyst and not as an excuse? I don't know. I just wanted to ask that question. Thank you.
Okay. Well, I can actually share one of the slides I didn't have time to show. Let me just see if I can get it quickly for you. Sorry, it won't be long, I don't think.
Can you share this? Yeah, it's coming up now. Yeah.
Okay, can you see a map?
Yes.
So this is the Sundarbans are down here in the southwest. Now you can see this map, which is from 73 to 2005, shows this is an active delta. An active delta means that the rivers flowing across it and into it are constantly changing. And more or less the whole of Bangladesh is delta land. So this is land, basically Bangladesh is the Himalayas over thousands of years washing down the rivers to form new land. So all of this is relatively new land in the last recent thousands of years. And this can be understood from aerial photos and satellite photos. So the red ones is where there's been erosion, and the blue ones is where there's been accretion. That means new land formed. So you can see down even in the Sundarbans down here, there is much more new land than lost land. On this island here, Sandvip, you see there is land being formed on that side of the island and lost on that side. In all, I have another slide which I won't be able to show you now. The amount of land being formed in the delta just slightly exceeds the land being lost in the delta. So we need to understand these scientific processes that are going on. even here on this major river here, you can see this is the riverbank erosion going on here and here. New land forms. So the question is not the problem of land erosion, but who owns the new land that is formed? And we know that under existing power systems in Bangladesh, those who take control of the new land that is formed, the chars in the river channels, are the powerful and the elite. And they will take control and keep that land, and they start charging rent on that land if poor people come in to use it. So we need to understand the actual science of how a delta operates and realize that actually the story of lost islands and so on is actually very misleading.
Thank you, Terry. Charu has a question.
Hi, so I wanted to know that has climate change become the new ideological apparatus in order to be louder?
Yeah.
So I just wanted to know if climate change has become the new ideological apparatus in order to reproduce power. And if yes, what particular lens do we use to get into this analysis of power and the relationship that climate change is sharing here?
Yeah, very good question. I would say yes, I think you're right. I think it is becoming a new ideology in order to detract from what is causing poverty. So, for example, you're all perfectly capable of understanding what causes poverty in India, that it relates to class, to caste, to gender. Those are the causes of poverty, which have been going on for decades and decades. And none of that poverty so far has been caused by climate change. It will be, but at the moment we can safely say that the reason people are poor in India has got nothing to do with climate change. So if we want to stop people being poor in India or anywhere else, it's important to stop climate change happening, which is by reducing emissions and so on. But we also need to stop the process by which poverty is caused, which is inherent to the class system of India. And so the focus has to be on that. And to the extent that people take on what you might call a nationalist argument about it, an ideology which argues that India has suffered at the hands of the West in relation to climate change, that enables, for example, in Bangladesh, the government is very, very quick to say, you've got to give us money for the damage you've caused us from climate change. Not talk at all about why people are poor in Bangladesh. So I think you're right that it becomes an ideology which justifies the system of power rather than changes the system of power.
There's one question here in chat. The Paris Agreement is considered to be unfair to the global South. Based on your views, can it be considered a conflict of interest between the elite of these two segments, and is it going to affect the poor of the global South?
Well, my feeling is that on mitigation, that is reducing emissions, there are huge concessions to the global South because of the power of the class system in countries like India and Bangladesh. So, for example, the last COP, the Indian government sabotaged the attempt to reduce the use of coal in India by delaying it, the phasing out of coal by 10 years. Now, to my mind, that is quite clearly an interest of the elite class, which wants to benefit from the profits that they get from coal, and is harmful to the Indian people because they will suffer the extra global warming which will happen from it. So I think there is already significant evidence that the elites in the so-called global South have been able to manipulate, argue, negotiate for favorable treatment in the way in which the mitigation issue is dealt with. Now, on the adaptation issue, the global North is adamant that it does not want to give any money or only very little money to help the global South to adapt to climate change or indeed to have anything for loss and damage. The amounts of money which are being talked about in the COP negotiations which would be transfers to the global south to help them adapt to climate change, are pathetically small. The agreement is for $100 billion a year, of which only a fraction, a tiny fraction, is for adaptation. None at all is for loss and damage. And so here we do see a great inequality, which is where the power of the North, the so-called global North, the class interests and political interests of those people is overriding the needs of poor people in the global South. Having said that, I do worry that if the global North suddenly said, right, we're going to give $1,000 billion a year to enable people in India, Tanzania, and so on to cope with climate change, I doubt very much that the people of India or Tanzania would get that money to help them. I think that it would feed into the existing systems of power, and so it would be very, very unlikely that the majority of the poor people would benefit from those transfers of wealth. So I think part of the argument is to look for different ways in which the system of power, if money becomes available, how it would actually be made available to help poor people in India to deal with the effects of climate change.
There's one question from Chaukhai. Thank you for your presentation. When can we expect a Jeremy Corbyn to come to power in Britain, like we are expecting a Bernie Sanders in the US, given the ignorance/denials of the citizens of the said countries to this crisis, which has a class division? Thank you.
Okay, I think the best we can hope for is a relatively significant but small proportion of the people in Britain or the United States supporting politicians like Corbyn or their policies like Corbyn and Sanders. I think it's highly unlikely that they will become leaders. We might hope that they do, but I think the thing that we have to take into account is that there are millions of poor people in both countries who are uncomfortable with socialist ideas. And I think that the people who support socialist ideas have failed miserably to understand how they talk to people who are poor but do not think that socialism is the way in which they should be helped or take part in their own liberation. So I think that this requires much more understanding, not of how leaders come to power and might influence policies, but how we understand why people are captured into thinking that it is right to support people like Trump or Boris Johnson or Bolsonaro in Brazil, or now we face the prospect of an extreme right-wing person becoming the president of Argentina. What we have to understand is, why are people willing to support? What is it that drives them to support those? And addressing that, because otherwise the share of the vote or the share of the support that goes to people like Sanders or Corbyn is not going to increase.
I think someone had raised their hand. I'm just trying to find out. The person has left, but anyways, any final questions from the audience here? Okay, there's one in the chat. I think one. Oh, that's a long question. I think. Thanks, Professor Terry, for a provoking talk. I agree with your argument that climate change has become an excuse for the powerful and the wealthy to avoid the narrative of poverty in the global south. My question is, as you mentioned, that when the UK entered into the neoliberal economy, the wealth gap increased among the rich and the poor, as the rich were getting richer, and the implications of neoliberal policies. As recently India is entering into the neoliberal economy, what are your thoughts that whether India will become an economically imbalanced country because of neoliberalism?
Right. I don't think it's particularly recent. I mean, you can trace the opening up, so-called opening up and neoliberal policies to 1991. And I think the way in which income and wealth is distributed in India is shown in that graph that I showed you. I think it's probably likely to get worse because there is very little sign that the elite is willing to change the distribution of wealth and income. I think they basically, as in Britain, I think the elite and the rich don't care about ordinary people. They simply don't care. And I think that is the problem that we face, is that Britain before neoliberalism had a conservative party, the Tory party, which was called a one nation party. In other words, they supported the welfare state, they supported redistribution of wealth. But that party is now captured, as the Republicans in the United States, by those who favor neoliberal inequality, and they're a different kind of party now. But I don't see any alternative party which can do much to address the imbalance. So I think it's likely that wealth and income distribution in India will get worse. But it's not my area of study, so I might be wrong on that. I'm simply suggesting that those who have power at the moment in India are unlikely to change the situation, and so I think it will get worse. Yes, but that's just my personal opinion without being an expert on the topic.
Okay, I think we have the final question for today. It's from Rihanna. Thank you for a wonderful discussion. I come from the Northeast, and I would like to share my thoughts since we are facing a series of structured development issues. The concept of climate change are only weighted like a false flag or diversion from the real issues, that is the anthropogenic that is happening to the earth/world because of human actions, which is taking the earth to the brink of disaster, and disaster aid, and has got nothing to do with climate change. Climate change is just a product of that. Why are we dealing with the impact of what are we doing rather than going and trying to change the cause of that, which we say will cause the disaster and has put our very survival into question. If we change our perspective, then we will know that solutions are not what is being made out to be, like carbon trading, but which has emerged as the biggest solution. Each institution must change, or rather raise the moral question of greed in using these resources. Professor Terry, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, that's a very, very long statement. I can take that much more as a statement because I agree with almost all of it rather than a question. So I think what you've said there in your comments, Rohana, are things I would largely agree with. And I think it would take me a very long time to go into detail on some of the points where we might have things we need to clarify. So I think we can email to afterwards if you want. My email is on the slides, so if you want to, we can correspond on that. I think that relating to carbon trading, I think one of the interesting things is that carbon trading itself was the capture of the policy at COP by neoliberals. The idea that you can trade your way out of this with carbon trading was itself a product of the elite, especially in the United States, capturing the kind of policy which the COP was able to introduce, because it destroyed the idea that you could have taxation at the point of extraction. If there had been taxation on each source of oil and gas and coal in the world to pay for the damage which those fossil fuels were going to do, a tax to pay for how it was going to damage and destroy the world systems, you would have had less than 1,000 entities to think about taxing. So you could capture a very huge proportion of the fossil fuel production with around less than 1,000, I forget the exact figure, taxes on how they dig the coal and the oil and the gas out the ground. Whereas the carbon trading system is extremely complicated and has been corrupted and made inefficient, and in many instances doesn't work. So I think actually your point about carbon trading is that it was a supposed solution which has become part of the problem, and it has delayed the ability to control the extraction of carbon dioxide through fossil fuels, delayed it by decades, if not forever.
Okay, I think we have also run out of time. But with that, I on behalf of HSS IIT Gandhinagar would like to really extend a warm note of appreciation to Professor Cannon for taking out his time and sharing this hour with us. And I hope that once he's in Ahmedabad, he can certainly visit campus and have a much longer discussion on the very vital issues. So with that, I thank you once again, and I thank the audience for coming here and asking such relevant questions, and we hope to continue this conversation forward. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Terry. Thank you.
Very welcome. Enjoyed it. Thank you.